So first of all, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Absolutely, yeah. So my name is Jeff Dolan. I currently work for the Boston Red Sox. I'm going into my third year with the organization. I've had a different title each year. My title for this upcoming year is going to be Assistant Minor League Strength and Conditioning Coordinator. I also am the Rehab Strength Coordinator, so work with all of our long-term rehab guys. And also I help with some kind of integrated sports science, player development initiatives, so to speak. Prior to the Red Sox, I worked 1 year in the NBA with the Phoenix Suns. I've worked in college baseball and college soccer at the University of Illinois. And my first big boy job was with the New York Yankees a number of years ago. That's how I got my start in strength and conditioning.
So been to New York Yankees, been to Phoenix Suns,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's Boston Red Sox, right?
Yes.
So what's the difference between these three organizations?
So I think, obviously there's probably more similarities between the Yankees and the Red Sox, both being in the same sport. The culture from organization to organization is a little bit different from the Yankees to the Red Sox, but they're the two most well-known baseball teams in the world for a reason. They go to it about it from slightly different places, but they're both very successful organizations that believe in winning and expect to win. So that's kind of the biggest similarity there. Um, Most of my career has been in baseball. So when I took the basketball job, it was a little bit of a culture shock. It took me a little while to adapt. But within a couple months, I started feeling more comfortable learning the lingo, learning how the schedule worked, learning how to deal with a different type of athlete. And I think that, though my time in basketball was pretty short, I think there's really nothing you can do that will help you more to grow from a professional standpoint than to work with a sport that you're really not very familiar with, and you have to learn all of it from the ground up. And I think it really pushes you to grow.
Did you enjoy uh the last two pro setting experience?
Yeah, yeah. I think obviously, really everywhere I've been, I've really enjoyed. But I've spent more time at the professional level with three different organizations over two sports. The NCAA setting was also awesome. Again, kind of similarities, but also some pretty big differences just in how you operate on a day-to-day basis, the rules governing, when people can lift, how much they can lift, or how often, and having multiple teams at the same time that you're in charge of managing also creates its own challenge. And I only really had two teams. Obviously, there are strength coaches that work in colleges that have to work with the entire athletic department. So that just changes how you are able to manage certain situations, and you know all of those environments challenge you in different ways and help you to grow.
Cool, cool. So working with baseball athletes, there's a lot of rotation, and for especially for especially for pitcher, they want to throw faster.
Mm-hmm.
They must have strong lower limbs strength, right? So usually how uh as a strength coach, we usually talk to our athletes or talk to our clients that 2 times body weight is strong enough. But for athletes, it's kind of different. Maybe sometimes it's too heavy or like not heavy enough. So for those pitchers, how strong are they?
So it's been a long time since I actually had someone do, like a traditional true 1 rep max test, really in any sort of exercise. We get a lot of data on how much force someone can produce from counter movement jump on force plate. We're in the process of we do have a force plate mound, which would be, there are force plates in the mound itself, so you can actually measure the ground reaction forces and such of guys while they pitch. So that's going to tell you about how much force they're producing, how they're producing it, when they're producing it, in the specific skill of pitching, which is obviously going to be more relevant than something as arbitrary as putting a barbell on your back and squatting to a certain depth and pushing it up. That being said, obviously pitching is a skill that requires a lot of strength and explosiveness, and also a very high level of coordination. So we know that force is generated from an interaction with the ground and is transferred up the body and out through the arm when the ball is released. So the lower half has to be strong and powerful to take that force from the ground and send it up. And if we look at research on force plates in mounds, like I mentioned before, we know that when a pitcher strides towards the plate, his back leg is going to create an anterior posterior force that's like 35% of his body weight. So there is some pushing that goes on. And on the front side, when the front foot lands, there's going to be 1.5 times body weight of vertical force that goes up through that leg, and 3/4 of your body weight in force going backwards in braking forces too. So basically you have to produce force and produce tension in the backside to push you towards the plate. And then the front leg has to be that brake and has to be an anchor, basically, so that everything can rotate around that strong, stable front leg, and everything can be converted into rotational movement and angular velocity, which is just going to end up letting the baseball carry. So there has to be huge amounts of strength, power, stability in the lower body. There's plenty of research that says that if you participate in a resistance training program, you can increase your pitching velocity. Oftentimes those are not necessarily, like, you have to look at the study population though. So obviously if someone is a high schooler throwing 75 miles an hour or 80 miles an hour or something like that, if they have a much larger window to, improve their performance. So in the case of someone like that, a couple of years of a good solid resistance training program, maybe you go from 70 to 80, 85, or maybe up to 90 or something like that. In the world that I live in, where everybody already throws hard, it's making much smaller, minute changes, but they are still, velocity is still something that if we improve it, it's probably good. And for example, like if we have a guy that throws 91 and 94, something like that, if we can enhance his training, his mechanics, his physical capacity, so that we can get him to like a 93 to 96 guy, the chances of him being able to continue on in his career and play at a higher level, they probably go up with most guys. So depending on who you work with, obviously I'm a big believer that strength training plays a big part in it. And really it's all about how you can create force and how you can transfer force through the system.
I love this. So you mentioned a interesting thing or like that you haven't really done like one RM test for a long time. For some coaches, this is gonna be a stupid question, but I'm gonna ask anyway. Why didn't you like go like do the one RM test for your athletes?
So for me, there's a couple things. One, obviously, is the risk and the reward. All right. So yeah, at the level that I work at, these guys are getting paid to play. Some of them are getting paid a lot. Some of them have been paid a lot as a signing bonus. Some of them have the potential to be paid a lot. And we do know that the rate of injury in weight training sessions is low, very low. However, for me in my position, it has to be zero. It can't be low. It has to be absolutely zero. So those of us who love the weight room and have spent a lot of time in the weight room and who have maybe competed in powerlifting or something like that, or just love to lift heavy, we all either have been injured ourselves in the weight room or know someone who has. And for me and my population, that just can't happen because I will lose my job and potentially wreck someone's career. And two, I know you mentioned that kind of traditional heuristic where, you know, squatting 2 times your body weight would be an objective that you would want to achieve to consider that to be, you know, a prerequisite level of strength, right? I don't think that's true. I think you know, a lot of heavy lifting is just is a skill, and I don't train. I don't need to create lifters. I need to create. I think Joe Ken used to say he needs competent lifters that are competitive athletes, not competitive lifters, right? So that's another big thing too. The third thing is I actually tend to steer clear of bilateral lifting for pitchers, just because. So if you take a look at the people who are best at bilateral lifting in the world, that requires a certain adaptation, right? Your body changes in a way to help you achieve that task. And I don't know about you, but if I have, you know, let's say I'm strong as hell and I got 1,000 pounds on my back, I probably only want to be able to squat down to about 90 degrees. And I don't want to actually physically get lower than that. For someone who plays a sport, you're probably going to have to be able to get lower than that. If I got 700-pound deadlift in my hands, I don't want a whole lot of thoracic rotation because I don't want that thing spinning on me because that's going to get sideways real quick. If I'm going to bench, whatever, 500 pounds, I don't want a lot of shoulder mobility because I want to basically be locked in this groove right here and be able to move it. So the body will actually adapt to decrease degrees of freedom. Right? It'll take away the ability to rotate. And for my athletes, particularly my pitchers, their ability to rotate is their ability to feed their families. So I have found that doing more unilateral training, whether that's pure unilateral training or just, you know, split stance variations or lunging variations, that type of thing, more unilateral hinging patterns, I've found that to be more conducive to developing my athletes in a way that's not going to take away from their ability to go out and do what they actually have to do to compete and go on to the next level. Or with my rehab guys, like the last thing I need to do is create another problem. We've already got a dude who's broken. I'm going to try to control all that I can control to make sure that we don't end up creating another issue. So that's kind of how I approach my lower body stuff with pitchers. Now, that being said, like, yeah, I push them heavy. I find ways to challenge them. But for me, it has to be the greatest possible return for the lowest possible risk or the lowest possible cost.
Great. I really love this. I mean, I know I sent you a list of questions that we're gonna discuss, but I really enjoy your answer, man.
Cool. Yeah, no, well, I mean, we'll talk about whatever. We can talk about music if you want.
So, for those for those who just mentioned that uh instead of like doing 1 RM test, you probably do some tests, performance tests on probably like force plates, that kind of stuff. Can you like uh talk a little about what kind of tests do you do on a force plate, or what kind what kind of tests do you do on or on any technology?
So we do use Force Decks as our force plates. They've had them here for a number of years. I also used them when I was with the Suns, so I'm pretty familiar with those now. We also use the Nordic curl. We may screw around with some other types of tests beyond the counter movement jump. And we have some movement screen stuff and some more medical based things. And then obviously baseball is an incredibly numbers driven sport. So a guy steps on a baseball field and does anything, we have a number for that. So, force plate testing in baseball is fairly new. We have a lot of data on it because we've been doing it for a number of years. There's not too terribly much published research on force plate jumps in a baseball specific population. I actually was reading about this week, so it's fresh in my mind. That's why I can spit all this back. I'm not a genius who remembers every study, but there was a study from 2020, which I think was actually financed by Sparta Science. So they have their 3 metrics, which they use with everybody. And I'm guessing this was with the Colorado Rockies because I know that they had contracted Sparta. So they look at 3 metrics being eccentric rate of force development, average concentric vertical force, and average concentric vertical impulse. I'm confident about 1 and 3. The number 2 is some sort of vertical force metric. And basically what they found, this was kind of what does counter movement jump on a force plate tell us about injury risk type of study. And they found that players with, in the lowest quadrant of eccentric RFD have higher rate of injury to the elbow. And then the other significant findings were not those other 2 metrics themselves, but actually the interaction between them. So either you produce a ton of force in a short amount of time, or a low amount of force in a long time, which intuitively would probably not lead to great performance either. But the groups that fell into those metrics tended to be injured more often. And then there's another one too that I can't recall, but it's a process that we continue. Oh, that's right. Somebody wrote their master's thesis. I wish I remembered this guy's name. I just read his paper. It was actually really good. So that's what it was. He had 2 groups of college baseball pitchers that he grouped into a harder throwing group and a slower throwing group, and basically looked at their force plate stuff like while actually throwing, and then their jumps. And between the harder throwing group and the slower throwing group, the harder throwing group had better concentric impulse. So that's that's kind of something that came up twice, is that concentric impulse is probably an important metric. So I think if you look at something that's decelerative based and something that's accelerative based, it's going to give you a pretty decent idea of just general athleticism and how they produce force. Does it always translate one-to-one to someone jumps like this, so therefore they show this exact same movement strategy when they throw? I have a hard time believing that's the case, but the theory, at least the general support behind the approach of a jump to extrapolate to a throw, is that they're both tasks that require you to summate force well and to coordinate force up and down the kinetic chain efficiently. So it's a start. And, I think one of our goals, and I'm sure the goal of every other organization too, is to find what are the tests that actually matter. Like what can we see which will differentiate guys who will perform better and guys who will stay healthier than others. And it's a tall task to look through it, but I think it's worthwhile, because we don't want to leave any stone unturned in terms of developing players that will help us win championships.
Yeah. So next thing I want to discuss is also a thing you mentioned, that you don't think players should be lifting like twice their body weight that heavy. So like how heavy would you go when you do the unilateral training?
So I feel a lot better. If someone is strong enough to lift twice their body weight on, let's say, a reverse lunge or something like that, I know that man is strong. But again, like, how much of a stimulus can we give to the system to increase force output, whether that's muscular or whether that's neurological, whether that's hormonal response, whatever it is? How can I maximize that response with the lowest possible risk, right? So, man, I wish I remembered the exact details, but if you Google Mike Boyle, everybody knows. But Alex Natera and his group actually found a study, and they did a study a couple of years ago where they actually determined, like, okay, if you look at a bilateral squat with a barbell on your back, what's the equivalent to a single leg squat? And I believe it's that if you do a true single leg squat with 3/4 of your body weight and additional load, that's basically the equivalent of a double body weight squat. But achieving that obviously is less absolute load, so therefore it's going to be much less risky. So, for years I was that guy who was like, Mike Boyle, like, he's just being soft. Like, I got introduced to strength and conditioning through powerlifting, which a lot of us do. And for the first part of my career, I was like, no, you just got to get stronger, and it'll solve all of your problems. And now, as I'm a little bit older and hopefully a little bit wiser, I just I'm much more cautious with how I load guys. And I have not had anyone back squat at all since 2019. And I've had force plates that whole time, and we still find a way to make those numbers go up. So, being married to, I will never be someone who's going to say, like, you don't need to lift, you don't need a weight room. Obviously, I will forever believe that strength is an important part of your physical preparation, but sometimes we need to look at how we're defining strength.
Yeah. So what exactly triggered you to change from doing like heavy back squat to like unilateral movement?
I think it was a couple things. So one, I have seen someone get hurt. I have seen a team sport athlete get hurt in the weight room. And I said, okay, never again. This is not going to happen. Two, even with the guys that were doing bilateral lifting, I expected them to start throwing harder and hitting the ball harder. And to a certain extent they did. But I had guys that, either they had back issues or whatever, that I was modifying their lifts to be unilateral. And that group actually saw better increases in baseball metrics and things like sprint speed, that type of thing, than the other group. And at the time I was kind of like, I'm influenced a lot by Boyle, but also by people like Chris Corfist, who doesn't do anything bilateral. And I've met him and I've talked to him a lot. Well, not a lot, but several times I've talked to Chris and really understood kind of the methodology that he was using with his speed guys, and talked about how we could apply that to baseball. And as I've gone, a number of years now and completely phased out the back squat, my guys are improving as well or better than they would have before. And Corfist has that same exact study. A lot of strength coaches have that same exact story to tell. Like, when you get into it, you're full of testosterone, and you want to see dudes crushing heavy weights, and the squat, bench, and the deadlift is the be all end all, and that's how you're a dude, and that's how you're gonna get better at sport. And then you run across someone who can't squat their body weight yet does unbelievable things on the field of play. It's just like, well, what's going on there? And then obviously working with the basketball, working with NBA guys, like the least expensive asset, so to speak. My cheapest guy that I worked with was worth $1.8 million. So I had a better chance of getting pregnant than of me putting something on his back. That wasn't going to happen. And so you find a way to mitigate the risk that's still effective. And guess what? Those guys improve too. So that's kind of my approach now.
Man, as a strength coach myself, I really enjoy the thing you just talked, and I really love your mindset about like when one of your athletes get injured, that's not gonna happen again. I really love that mindset.
Yeah.
So, going back to the list of the questions, sorry about that. But when when baseball players do like rotation movement, is it the same with pitcher and hitter? Is the rotation about the same, or there's difference in it?
It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. And there are similarities in any sort of like throwing anything, whether it's a baseball, football, softball, whatever. The throw is pretty much the same, and any sort of punch is similar. The only difference is a punch you would deliver the impact and then pull back. A swing is similar because everything is going to be sequenced in a way to create rotational force to deliver the bat head into the zone. So it is very similar, a very similar kind of movement.
Cool. So, when it's a hitter, what exactly happened when they hit the ball during the rotation? What happens in the front leg? What happens in the back leg?
Sure. So when you look at any sort of rotational task, swinging or pitching, you have to look at something called the kinematic sequence, right? Same thing like golf, even hockey, like to a certain extent. Any sort of swing, any type of throw, it's basically looking at the timing of the acceleration of different segments of your body, and they get faster and faster and faster as you go from proximal to distal. And basically you look at the peak angular velocity of the pelvis, the torso, the arm, and the hand. And you determine what the sequence is of those peaks and what the relationship to the other body parts are. So when the sequence is optimal, they accelerate in exactly that order that I laid out before, and then they decelerate in the same order. So that allows for the creation or the transfer of force and of kinetic energy up through and the summation of that energy, which eventually leads to things speeding up and being fastest out here away from you. So the first thing, like throwing and hitting, similar in that you're going to start with your weight more so on your back leg. You're going to shift your center of mass forward by creating force going backwards. And then you're going to land on a stable front foot, which is going to, like we talked about before, allow for that transfer of energy on up. So the pelvis is going to rotate first, but the torso is going to lag a little bit, which is going to create a stretch across with the anterior oblique sling, basically everything from the front hip to the back shoulder, which allows for some stretch shortening cycle through the connective tissue and the muscles here to be loaded and to release that energy and speed up as everything else goes. Pelvis goes, torso lags. When the pelvis decelerates and stops moving, that's when the next segment goes. And same thing for torso to arm, etc. So it's kind of the best analogy is looking at how you crack a whip, right? So this accelerates and then it stops. This accelerates and everything comes out and ends up cracking at the end, right? But that can't happen. Like you can't crack a whip like this, right?
Yeah.
It has to be, everything has to be sequential. It has to be that. And the deceleration at the right time is what creates that transfer of energy on out to create that snap. So regardless of whether you're looking at pitching or hitting, that's one of the most important aspects of it. And like Titleist Performance Institute does a great job educating about this. Driveline does a great job, and there are different ways to measure this. Typically, once you get to the guys that I work with, most guys, if they have sequencing issues, they're going to be very, very minor because you don't end up performing at a high level in swinging or throwing if you have a completely wrong, sequence. It's just not going to happen. But if you take lower level, like if you take a kid, you take a middle school or high school or something like that who's not very good, you can see all sorts of weird patterns of sequencing and acceleration and deceleration, which is realistically, if you look at the task and the kinematic sequencing, that's when you begin to see, like, okay, circling back to the conversation we had before, like it's important to be able to create force and to be able to produce power and to withstand forces, but really, like, the money is made in the sequencing and timing and coordination of the movement. And that's exactly how. So I have the pleasure of working with Chris Sale, who's had a it's a reasonably successful career. World Series ring, Cy Youngs, that type of thing. And from a traditional strength coaching perspective, if you look at this man who's like 6'6", 170, 180, basically built like a string bean. Most people that don't have experience working with baseball players would say this guy is weak as hell and he needs to get stronger. Like he's just too skinny. It doesn't make sense that he would be able to produce enough force to throw a ball 95 plus miles an hour. But if you watch the fluidity and the coordination and the elasticity and the efficient power that he displays when he throws a baseball, you say, oh, okay, I get it. That's how he does it. He does it by syncing everything up and by timing everything and getting things to fire at the right time and then turn off at the right time.
Cool. So in order to create the whip you just mentioned, does that mean that, let's say you create the force through the lower body, the hip, the quad, hamstring, whatever it is, you create the force through the lower limb, does that mean that the upper body needs to be like what you just mentioned is stretch shortening cycle? So in order to create that stretch shortening cycle for the upper body, does that mean you need to do a lot of like iso work for the core, or a lot of like probably heavy strength training for the chest and shoulder?
So yes and no. I like doing isometric work for the torso, but you also have to be careful with that because, like we talked about before, I can't take away your ability to rotate. So my big thing is we need to have enough core strength and stability to make sure that we're able to fire those muscles at the right time, but also appreciating the fact that that timing of that firing is one of the most important aspects. So, I use this example when I was talking to someone yesterday. When you swing a bat, your core is not on the whole time. Like you're not grinding through it. There's a really great study from Stu McGill. I forget exactly when it was published, but he looked at combat sport athletes, and he looked at EMG of their core musculature when they throw a punch. And he basically identified kind of a what he called a double pulse in the EMG. So when they first come back and they give that impulse to throw the punch, there's a huge spike in muscle activity. And then from here to impact, it actually dissipates. So the muscles turn off. And then on impact, again, you see another huge spike. I see no reason why hitting a baseball wouldn't be the exact same thing. And same thing with throwing. You're trying to maximize the compression and the tension and the firing of everything at that point of either impact with the baseball or releasing a baseball if you're throwing. But you can't be stiff to get that done. You have to, like I said, you have to take advantage of the sequencing of everything in order to get all that to just happen. And then in terms of upper body stuff, there is minimal research saying that like pressing strength, for example, correlates with throwing velocity. And this goes to the conversation about overlifting that we had earlier as well. But if strength or size was a 1-to-1 correlation with throwing velocity, then Arnold Schwarzenegger would have thrown like 110 miles an hour. But I've never seen Arnold throw. I can guarantee he never threw very hard. So it's just those are the nuances of working with my specific sport is you have to be able to improve their strength in ways that doesn't steal from what they do well. So, I do have guys do dumbbell press, that type of thing. But like I said, I try to avoid things that lock you in. So I will either, if I do want to get some stability training, I'll have you do with one arm. My favorite to do is actually alternating. So you get expansion on one side and compression on the other side, and your rib cage can move a little bit like it has to when you throw. With any sort of row variation, I like to add a reach to the other side, just so you can train all those muscles while still allowing for that freedom of movement that you're going to need when you throw. And then, in terms of pushing strength aspects, your lats do need to be very strong, and everything on the back side of your shoulder need to be very strong, because anytime if you throw hard, anytime you release the ball, you're getting basically your body weight in terms of distraction forces at your shoulder. So everything back there that's involved in deceleration needs to be incredibly strong. You talked about, adaptations to throwing, right? So everything throwing is IR. If I go into ER, I'm getting a stretch shortening cycle on all the muscles that internally rotate. So my pecs, my lats, that type of thing, my subscapularis, all those get very strong just by throwing because of plyometric load. So most of what we have to do from a arm care perspective or an injury reduction perspective has to be to balance out or counteract what's happening as a result of what the sport is giving us. So external rotation work. There is an identified, Kevin Wilk, physical therapist, has identified an ER to IR ratio that if you're below that, it's a red flag for injury. I think it's 0.65, something like that, at 90 degrees ER, IR. So yeah, that's kind of the upper body approach to pitchers for me.
Appreciate that. So, kind of also circle back to the question about sequencing. Let's say if one of your athletes, when they throw a med ball, their upper body go first instead of the hip rotation, what exactly would you do to correct this movement?
So chances are, if I would see that in my pup, it's going to be a different answer for someone else, because I'm probably not going to see that. If I did see that, I would probably say the medicine ball is either too heavy, or I would just say, I would probably give them a little shit and be like, when you throw a baseball, do you throw a baseball like that? And they would probably say no. And I would say, okay, can you please rotate your hips? And they would probably say, okay. And then that will probably clean it up. In the case where someone is not as skilled as the guys that I'm around all the time, you could probably constrain the drill in some sort of way, or you could break it down into pieces, or you could even regress working on the pattern so much so that you actually isolate just the movement of rotating your pelvis, and keeping your torso stationary. Just get used to how that feels. There are ways that you can actually load that to get a feel for it. And then, I would probably break down the medicine ball throw itself to the point where I'm saying, okay, let's put you in a position where your hips are already rotated, or feel that rotation of your hip and then come through with your upper body. I don't love that, from a long-term standpoint, just because, like I said, sequencing and timing is everything, and that's going to disrupt everything. But if they really truly need to feel it broken down to that rudimentary of a movement, then you could do that, and then hopefully they'll have enough athleticism to be able to put that all together.
Cool. Last question before I let you go, okay?
Sure.
So there's gonna be a lot of injury for pitchers in their elbow, in their shoulder, when they throw a ball that fast, right? So how exactly do you minimize? I don't want to use prevent, but how exactly do you minimize the chances of them getting like injured in their elbow and shoulder?
Sure. Yeah. So, like you said, unfortunately, the fact of the matter is, injuries to the upper extremity in pitchers are very, very common. I think we're at the point now where something between like a quarter and a third of any pitcher who's pitching in the big leagues has actually had their UCL reconstructed, Tommy John surgery. So, and especially the elbow issues, the UCL tears continue to go up, which is, it sucks. So there are a lot of things that you can look at in terms of, what we're trying to do to prevent that, with still appreciating the fact that throwing a baseball at a high level is extremely traumatic. And there's really no way that we are ever going to be able to change that. It is what it is. Basically, the research is most clear that the biggest risk factor for tearing your UCL is throwing really hard. Like if you throw harder than 92, 93, your risk to get Tommy John surgery goes up. That's just the reality of the situation, and physics, the laws of the universe being what they are. And the average fastball velocity in Major League Baseball and in minor league baseball continues to go up, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. So it's no surprise if you take that into consideration that we are having more UCL tears. And if you talk to, obviously I've spent a lot of time around high level baseball players. If you talk to any pitcher, you begin to realize that everybody's arm feels like shit. It's kind of like with basketball players. Every single basketball player, their knees hurt. Like if you read research on patella tendinopathy and stuff in elite basketball players, it's going to tell you that it's like 50%, 70%. No, it's 100% of basketball players' knees hurt. It's just what it is. Like they play a lot of basketball, and that's hard on the knees. If you do a sport where you're delivering a 5-ounce projectile and your arm is moving 7,000 degrees per second, that's a lot of stress. And there's ways we can try to approach minimizing it, but ultimately there's going to be a lot of stress. And actually the UCL, like the force that is encountered by the UCL when you throw, it's actually more force than the tensile strength of the tissue. So like if you were to take a cadaver and just give them valgus stress on their UCL, it would take less force than they get with pitching to tear that thing. So basically everything else, the entire body has to help this ligament withstand that force. If it's left out to dry, like if your forearm is fatigued, your UCL is more at risk to tear. If your mechanics are off, your UCL is at more risk to tear. If you're weak, your UCL is at more risk to tear. We talked about, distraction forces during deceleration are literally your body weight in force. So really, it takes a fully integrated team approach to managing pitchers and trying to mitigate their injury risk. It really does. So strength side, medical side, sports science from a workload management perspective, pitching coaches from a mechanics perspective, it takes all of them. But basically, like from my perspective, like what I have control over trying to give them in terms of preventative interventions, basically training a high level pitcher for performance and training them for health is the same thing. if you work at a lower level, that's not necessarily the case. Like if even when I worked in college, it wasn't necessarily 100% the case, right? Because I was trying to help create something. Obviously, I had some kids that were super talented, and I had kids that weren't so much so. You go to the next level, and everybody is that talented. Everyone is that dude who was, a top 5 guy on their college team. Just everybody is that now. So if health and performance are the same thing in a high level population, then you have to consider, okay, well, what is arm care? For me, arm care is not an isolated thing. It's taking care of your whole body. So you can break that down into as many categories as you want. Like off the top of my head, like range of motion is part of it. Working with baseball players is unique because anyone who's the high level thrower is going to have unique adaptations to their throwing shoulder, which if you saw it in someone who doesn't throw a baseball at a high level, you would be like, what the hell is that? There are huge adaptations that you get in terms of structure from throwing a baseball. Some of them are more genetic, like certain people are naturally more external rotation biased, so they're probably going to be better at throwing just naturally. And then over time, especially as you grow up throwing, it actually changes the architecture of your arm and your shoulder. It actually retroverts the humerus, so it opens up more external rotation by changing the nature of how the growth plate actually forms. But that being said, like if you do look through research, there are, even within that weird group of high level baseball players, there are range of motion considerations that are correlated with injury. So the biggest one used to be glenohumeral internal rotation, or rotation deficit from side to side. There's some research that says that is a valid thing to worry about, and there's actually some research that says that it doesn't matter. Some of the newer research says that actually having less side-to-side difference is a higher risk factor, and that like having what they would call an external rotation insufficiency, or having not enough difference in external rotation in your throwing arm, is actually a red flag. But the big one that I think that we can really influence is shoulder flexion is a big one, especially for elbows. So we spend a lot of time trying to restore flexion. Obviously, with all the stress that is placed on a throwing shoulder, especially like on the lat, we get a lot of micro trauma and a lot of damage to the lat. So a tight lat is going to make it difficult for you to flex your shoulder. So we spend a lot of time on that. There's some research says that horizontal abduction is something to consider. So basically, in terms of these range of motion things, it's going to be, like I said, a team approach. Like, what can the medical staff do from a soft tissue perspective, from a joint mobilization perspective? And then how can I utilize techniques in the weight room, or even sometimes I'll go in the training room and do it. Like, how can I utilize certain respiratory techniques to influence rib cage movement and mechanics to affect change at the shoulder? Can I do something to change the orientation of your pelvis to affect everything, to affect range of motion at your hip or at your shoulder? How does your thoracic spine rotate? If your thoracic spine is bogged down and doesn't rotate well, chances are there's going to be consequences higher up. Do your hips rotate? Are you able to internally rotate into your front hip as you deliver a pitch? Because if you're not, you're going to have to crank through your torso, and that's going to be, that's going to predispose you to lumbar spine issues, oblique issues, or even farther up, shoulder, elbow. Again, like everything's connected in this chain. So everything has to work, and if one link breaks down, there's going to be consequences farther on. Range of motion, we talked about. Strength stuff we talked about already. Strong, stable lower half, the ability to withstand force, range of motion in the lower half, and the ability to control that range of motion is important. Strength on the backside of the shoulder, especially the rotator cuff obviously is very important in its ability to keep the humeral head centrated in the shoulder joint. We talked about how that gets screwed up with IR, balance with the IR, and how does the scapula move? Because the scapula is going to dictate the position of the shoulder and how much room is there for it to translate superiorly. So can the scapula upwardly rotate and can it posteriorly tilt to allow for that flexion, which we talked about before? And we talked about pitching mechanics, like does someone sequence well? Does someone coordinate well? Is there an energy leak when their front foot hits the ground? So that's a long explanation for things that we try to do. Obviously, the odds are stacked against us just because of the nature of what throwing a baseball at a high level is. But as far as I'm concerned, if I and the team that I work with have done everything in our power and everything that we can control in order to give these guys the best possible chance of being successful, then we've done our job. And from there, the universe or God or whomever you look to as a higher power is going to determine what happens from there.
Love that, man. I really, really enjoy talking to you. That's kind of like all the questions I have for today. So if there's like, because I have like coaches and therapists gonna watch this, so if there's like coaches and therapists are interested in what we are talking about today, where can they reach out to you? Really love this.
Sure. Yeah. Best place right now would be Instagram. My handle is Hammer of Dolan, all one word. I will get a website up and running here at some point. It's not ready yet. It's in the very, very beginning stages, and obviously my day job makes it somewhat difficult to make progress on that in a hurry, but we'll get there someday. But in the meantime, reach out on Instagram. I spend a decent amount of time on there, and I like interacting with people on there. So that's where I would go.
Cool. So that's all for today.